The factory floor in Shenzhen is humming in early 2025. Engineers in cleanroom suits are calibrating chips that did not exist 3 years ago. The wafers are Chinese. The architecture is Chinese. And the name on the package is not Nvidia. Here is the question nobody in Silicon Valley wants to answer out loud. What happens to the most valuable semiconductor company on Earth when the market it was told it could not lose starts building the product it was told it could not make? We are about to walk through 3 layers of what is actually happening. Because the surface story, the one about export controls and restricted chip lists, is not the real story. The real story is about a system of technological dependency that was built over 2 decades, treated as permanent, and is now dissolving faster than any analyst publicly predicted. Stay with this until the end, because the final layer is the one that changes how you read every earnings call, every sanctions announcement, and every data center announcement for the next decade. If you follow the kind of analysis that goes deeper than the press release, you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next. Let us start with what Nvidia actually is, because most people who follow the stock do not fully understand the structure of the machine. Nvidia does not simply make graphics cards. Nvidia has built what engineers call a full-stack moat. The chip is the hardware. CUDA, its proprietary software platform, is the layer that locks developers in, and the data center ecosystem, built on top of both, is the layer that makes switching costs almost prohibitively high. That is the official story of invincibility. 3 walls, not one. The H100 accelerator, launched in 2022, became the defining infrastructure of the artificial intelligence boom. Training a large language model without access to H100s was, for most organizations, not a practical option. Clusters of 10,000 units were ordered by hyperscalers. Waiting lists stretched across quarters. Prices on secondary markets reached $40,000 per unit. The constraint was not demand. It was the physical impossibility of manufacturing enough. Nvidia's gross margins climbed above 78%. The company crossed a $1 trillion market capitalization in June 2023, then kept going. And then Washington made a decision that it believed would freeze the clock. The export control framework that the United States Bureau of Industry and Security began building in October 2022 was designed around a specific theory. If you restrict Chinese access to advanced chips, and you restrict access to the equipment needed to manufacture advanced chips, you create a capability gap that China cannot close without years of delay. The assumption embedded in that theory was that semiconductor physics is universal, but semiconductor manufacturing is not. You can understand how to design a chip. You cannot easily build the machines that make it. The Dutch company ASML makes the only extreme ultraviolet lithography machines in the world capable of printing the most advanced nodes. Washington applied pressure. ASML stopped shipping to China. The theory seemed sound. It held for approximately 18 months. What the export control framework did not fully account for was the difference between restricting a capability and eliminating the incentive to develop it. China's semiconductor industry before 2022 was partially content to buy from the outside because buying from the outside was cheaper and faster than building from within. The moment that option closed, the calculus changed entirely. Restriction did not slow Chinese semiconductor development. It funded it. The numbers are specific. China's central government allocated an estimated $47.5 billion to its semiconductor industry through the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, commonly called the Big Fund, across its first and second phases. A third phase, confirmed in May 2024, added another $47.5 billion. That is roughly $95 billion of directed state capital aimed at a single industrial objective. For context, that is larger than the entire annual revenue of ASML and Intel combined. This is where a man named Jensen Huang, who built Nvidia from a small graphics card startup in Santa Clara into the infrastructure backbone of the artificial intelligence era, faces a problem that is not solvable with a better product. Ask yourself this: is it possible to compete with a company whose losses are covered by the sovereign wealth of a nation of 1.4 billion people, and whose entire purpose is not profit, but strategic independence? By late 2024, Huawei's Ascend 910B processor was shipping in volume to Chinese customers who had previously been on waiting lists for Nvidia H100/. The performance numbers, leaked from internal benchmarks, placed the Ascend 910B at somewhere between 60 and 75% of H100. Performance on standard training workloads, not equal, not better, but close enough. Close enough that a Chinese hyperscaler, facing the choice between waiting indefinitely for a restricted American chip and deploying a domestic alternative with full government support and no geopolitical risk, chose the domestic alternative. Every time. Camila Reyes, a procurement strategist for a mid-sized artificial intelligence firm in Singapore, described the shift in terms that strip away all the geopolitical abstraction. Her firm had been sourcing compute through distributors with indirect access to Nvidia hardware. By mid-2024, lead times had stretched to 9 months. The price per unit had increased 31% in a single quarter. She began evaluating alternatives. Within 6 months, she was running pilot workloads on Chinese-manufactured accelerators shipped through a legal third-party arrangement. The performance was not identical. The price difference was 40%. The availability was immediate. She made the switch for 70% of new deployments. This is not an anomaly. This is a pattern. The second layer of the problem is not about chips at all. It is about software, which is where Nvidia believed its moat was truly unassailable. CUDA has been in continuous development since 2006. There are an estimated 4 million CUDA developers worldwide. The investment made by the global artificial intelligence research community in CUDA-compatible code represents, conservatively, hundreds of thousands of developer years of work. Rewriting that work for a different hardware architecture is not trivial. Nvidia has always understood this. The chip was the door. CUDA was the lock. What Nvidia did not fully anticipate was the emergence of abstraction layers that make the lock less relevant. Libraries like PyTorch, which now dominates academic and production machine learning workflows, have progressively decoupled the user-facing code from the underlying hardware. When you train a model in PyTorch today, you can redirect that workload to different hardware with changes that are measured in lines, not months. The Chinese company Cambricon has been building hardware-agnostic compiler toolchains since 2021. Huawei's CAN software stack, designed specifically to make migration from CUDA to Ascend practical has been adopted by more than 120 Chinese universities and research institutions as of early 2025. The CUDA lock is not broken, but the door it was securing is being rebuilt around it. Here is what we are actually watching, and this is the layer that most coverage misses entirely. We are not watching China try to catch up to Nvidia. That framing is already obsolete. We are watching China build a parallel technological ecosystem in which Nvidia is structurally unnecessary. These are different problems with different timelines and different solutions. Catching up implies the destination is fixed. A parallel ecosystem means the destination itself is being moved. A researcher named Wei Jianming, based at a state-affiliated computing laboratory in Wuhan, published benchmark results in March 2025, showing that a cluster of 800 Ascend 910C processors using Huawei's distributed training software completed a standard large language model training run in 91% of the time required by an equivalent Nvidia H100 cluster. The margin of performance difference has closed to the point where it is within the noise floor of practical deployment decisions. The experiment ran entirely on domestic Chinese infrastructure. No American components, no American software, no American cloud services. Would you build your company's artificial intelligence strategy on hardware you might not be able to buy next quarter, or on hardware that is slower but guaranteed to be available for the next 20 years? This is the question that every chief technology officer in Asia, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and increasingly Europe is sitting with right now. And the answer is not as obvious as Nvidia's stock price has implied. The third layer is the one about time, and it is the most consequential. The semiconductor industry runs on multi-year investment cycles. A design decision made today produces revenue in 3 to 5 years. A fab investment committed today produces chips in 4 to 7 years. When Nvidia and Washington built the export control strategy, they were thinking in terms of the current generation of chips and the next generation. What they were not fully pricing in was the generation after that, and the one after that. China's domestic semiconductor ecosystem, even with the restriction of extreme ultraviolet lithography machines from ASML, has been making measurable progress at the nodes available to it. The Shanghai-based Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, known as SMIC, produced 7-nanometer chips in 2023 using a technique called deep ultraviolet multi-patterning, a workaround that is slower, more expensive, and less yield efficient than extreme ultraviolet processes. But that produces functional chips nonetheless. The yield rates were below 50% in early production runs. By late 2024, informed estimates place the yield rate above 68%. The learning curve is not flat. It is steep and it is climbing. There is a scenario, and it is not a marginal one, in which, by 2028, China's domestic chip production is sufficient to supply its internal artificial intelligence demand at scale without any imported hardware from the West. The export controls would, in that scenario, have succeeded in their stated short-term objective and failed at their structural long-term objective. They would have created a competitor instead of a dependent. The Nvidia that enters that world is not the Nvidia that dominated 2023. It is a company that has lost access to what was, before the controls, its second largest geographic market by revenue. China represented between 20 and 25% of Nvidia's data center revenue in 2022. The restricted entities and modified chip rules have been progressively closing even the partial access that remained. Every tightening of the control framework reduces Nvidia's addressable market in a region that is simultaneously becoming the world's largest consumer of artificial intelligence compute. Jensen Huang has said publicly that losing China is losing a significant opportunity. That framing is careful and deliberate. What it does not say is this: the China that Nvidia lost is not waiting, it is building. And it is building with urgency that is funded at a level no private company can rationally match. The story of Nvidia and China is not a story about chips. It is a story about what happens when dependency is mistaken for loyalty, when a market relationship is assumed to be permanent because it has been profitable, and when the assumption that others cannot build what you have built turns out to be wrong. Every technology monopoly in history has faced this moment. The moment when the barrier that seemed structural turns out to be temporal, when the moat that seemed permanent turns out to have been a delay. IBM faced it with the personal computer. Microsoft faced it with the browser. Intel faced it with the mobile processor. The companies that survived those moments did not survive because they held the old monopoly. They survived because they found the next one before the old one finished collapsing. The question for Nvidia is not whether it can protect what it has in China. That chapter is closing. The question is whether the next platform, the next lock-in, the next architecture that makes every competitor structurally irrelevant is already designed, or whether the company is still defending a position that the world is building around. That question does not have an answer today, and that silence is the most important data point in this entire story. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, consider sharing it with someone who is making decisions about technology, investment, or strategy in the next 5 years. They deserve to see this before the mainstream narrative catches up. Like this video, if you believe the real story is always a layer deeper than the headline. Subscribe to this channel because we do not stop at the official version. We keep going until we find what the official version is designed to obscure. That is why you are here. That is why we keep making these videos. The content of this video is based on strategic analysis reports, estimated data, and hypothetical scenarios concerning the economic and geopolitical context. The information is offered for reference, independent analysis, and documentary storytelling purposes. It does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. Images and materials used serve to illustrate the arguments presented.